40 Black Celebrities Who Had the Most Horrible Deaths, 2025. What if the brightest black stars, the voices that healed us, the heroes who inspired us, the leaders who changed history, met endings so brutal they still feel unreal? A plane falls from the sky. A balcony turns into a battlefield. A hotel room becomes a final silence. These aren't rumors or myths. They're the shocking last chapters of lives that shaped the world. Tonight, Legends of Black Excellence uncovers the heartbreaking truths behind these tragedies, not for drama, but for remembrance. Stay with us to the end, because each story hits deeper than the last. And tell me in the comments which loss still haunts you most. Bob Marley. When people talk about 40 black celebrities who had the most horrible deaths, Bob Marley stands out not because his ending was loud, but because it was cruel in a quieter way, like a slow fire hidden under a beautiful song. Marley wasn't just a reggae superstar. He was a global voice for black dignity, spiritual freedom, and the hope of the oppressed. By the late 1970s, he had become Jamaica's most famous son and one of the most recognizable figures on earth, filling stadiums with music that sounded like liberation itself. To millions, he seemed untouchable, an artist whose message was bigger than any one lifetime. That's what makes his death feel so devastating. The world's symbol of endurance was fighting something inside his own body that no fame, faith, or rhythm could soften. The nightmare began in 1977 with what looked like a minor injury, a dark spot beneath the nail of his right big toe after playing soccer. What seemed like a bruise was diagnosed as acral lentiginous melanoma, a rare and aggressive form of skin cancer. Doctors urged amputation to stop the spread, but Marley refused, influenced by his Rastafarian beliefs about keeping the body whole. He chose a less radical treatment and kept moving forward, touring as if momentum could hold death at bay. For a time, it looked like he had won. Yet the cancer was relentless. It spread silently through his system while he was still performing, still recording, still lifting up people who needed his words. His final concert came in September 1980 in Pittsburgh, an electrifying show that now plays like a bittersweet goodbye. Within months, the disease had reached vital organs, and his strength began to vanish with terrifying speed. In 1981, Marley sought treatment abroad, but by then the cancer had advanced too far. He wanted to return home to Jamaica, to the land that shaped his soul, but his body failed him on the journey. The flight was diverted to Miami, where he died on May 11, 1981, at only 36 years old. Imagine that a man who had already reshaped world music gone before middle age, leaving behind children who were still growing, and a mission that felt unfinished. His last words to his son Ziggy were simple and heartbreaking. "Money can't buy life." In the end, Bob Marley's death wasn't horrifying because of spectacle. It was horrifying because it stole a healer in the prime of his power, proving that even legends who sing about freedom can be trapped by fate. Yet his voice never really left. It just changed form, becoming a kind of heartbeat for everyone still learning to hope. Martin Luther King Jr. When the world remembers 40 black celebrities who had the most horrible deaths, the loss of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. sits at the center of America's conscience, not because he was an entertainer, but because he was a moral giant whose voice was shaping the nation in real time. By 1968, King had become the face of nonviolent resistance, the preacher whose "I Have a Dream" speech turned hope into a national language. He had already led the Montgomery bus boycott marched through Birmingham, and Selma accepted the Nobel Peace Prize at 35 and forced a country to look itself in the mirror. Yet even as the public honored him, the pressures around him tightened threats, surveillance, political hatred, and the growing danger of being a black man demanding justice on the world stage. He walked forward anyway, because that was the kind of faith he carried. On April 4, 1968, King traveled to Memphis, Tennessee to support striking sanitation workers, Black men fighting for fair wages and basic dignity. He stayed at the Lorraine Motel, a modest place that has now become a sacred landmark. That evening, just after 6:00 p.m., King stepped onto the second-floor balcony outside room 306, talking with friends and colleagues before heading to dinner. A single rifle shot rang out from across the street. King collapsed, mortally wounded. Chaos erupted in seconds, people pointing, shouting, running toward him, trying to hold on to a life that seemed too important to lose. He was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital, where doctors fought to save him, but by 7:05 p.m., Martin Luther King Jr. was pronounced dead. He was 39 years old. The assassination froze time, a leader at the height of influence, silenced in a blink, leaving the nation suspended between grief and disbelief. The horror of King's death wasn't only the violence of that moment, it was what it signaled. Cities across America burned with sorrow and rage. Millions felt the ground shift beneath them, as if the most hopeful thread in the national fabric had been cut. His killer, James Earl Ray, was arrested and convicted, but the tragedy's shadow stretched far beyond one man. To this day, many still wrestle with larger questions about hostility toward the movement King represented. Yet the ending did not erase the mission. If anything, it engraved it deeper. King's death became a final painful lesson about the cost of conscience and a permanent call to finish the work he refused to abandon. His body fell on that balcony, but his dream never did. Malcolm X. When we speak of 40 black celebrities who had the most horrible deaths, Malcolm X's story hits with a different kind of force, one that still shakes the heart decades later. He was not a celebrity in the Hollywood sense, but he was a towering public figure whose words cut through America's racial fog like a blade. Born Malcolm Little in 1925, he rose from a brutal childhood and time in prison to become one of the most electrifying voices of black self-determination. As a minister and spokesman for the Nation of Islam, Malcolm demanded pride, discipline, and freedom by any means necessary. He terrified enemies of equality and inspired millions who felt unheard, especially young black Americans searching for dignity in a country that denied it. But Malcolm's life was also a battlefield. By the early 1960s, he had become a national symbol, and symbols attract danger. After breaking with the Nation of Islam in 1964 and forming the Organization of Afro-American Unity, Malcolm's vision broadened. He began speaking about human rights on a global scale, building coalitions and warning that racism in the United States was not just a social flaw, but a moral crime. That transformation made him even more threatening to those who wanted him quiet. Death threats poured in. His home was firebombed. He traveled with caution yet refused to retreat. Malcolm knew the risk, but he believed silence would be a worse kind of death. On February 21, 1965, Malcolm stepped onto the stage of the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem to address a crowd of about 400 people. He was 39 years old, a husband and father with his wife Betty Shabazz and children nearby. The room was tense even before he began. Then, in a sudden burst of chaos, a disturbance flared in the audience, a classic diversion. As heads turned, 3 gunmen rushed forward. Shots exploded through the hall. Malcolm was struck multiple times, collapsing in front of his supporters. Panic ripped through the ballroom. People screamed, ducked, ran, and cried as blood spread across the stage where he had come to speak life into his people. He was rushed to Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, but it was already too late. Malcolm X was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The horror of Malcolm's assassination wasn't only its brutality, it was the timing. He was evolving, building, reaching for a future that frightened the powers around him. His death left a raw wound in the civil rights era, a violent attempt to stop a mind that refused to be owned. Yet the echo backfired. Malcolm's final chapter turned him into an immortal force. His speeches, his clarity, his refusal to bow, those survived the bullets. And for many, his life remains a reminder that truth-telling can be dangerous, but silence is a surrender he never accepted. Aretha Franklin. Aretha Franklin's death belongs in any honest conversation about 40 black celebrities who had the most horrible deaths. Not because her final chapter was violent or sudden on a public street, but because it was a long, quiet unraveling of a woman whose voice once sounded like it could move mountains. To millions, Aretha wasn't just the queen of soul, she was the sound of black strength itself. From the first thunder of respect in 1967 to the gospel fire she carried all her life, she sang pain into power and turned survival into art. Her career was historic. 18 Grammy Awards, more than 75 million records sold, and in 1987 she became the first woman inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. She performed at presidential inaugurations, stood near the heart of the civil rights movement, and gave America some of its most enduring emotional anthems. When a person like that begins to fade, it feels less like a celebrity story and more like the dimming of a national light. The cruel twist is that Aretha's illness advanced largely out of public sight. She had struggled with health issues for years, growing more private as rumors swirled. By the summer of 2018, it was clear something serious was happening. Friends, family, and a few visitors from her lifelong circle came quietly to her Detroit home as she entered hospice care. The diagnosis, later confirmed by her doctors, was an advanced pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor, a rare and aggressive form of pancreatic cancer. It's the kind of disease that can feel like a thief in the body, slow at first, then suddenly unstoppable. Even for someone who spent her whole life singing with unstoppable force, the cancer reduced her world to breath rest and the presence of loved ones. On August 16, 2018, Aretha Franklin died at home in Detroit, 76 years old. The horror of her death isn't found in spectacle, it's found in contrast. Think about that. A woman whose voice filled churches, arenas, and history books, spending her last days in quiet rooms fighting a disease that doesn't negotiate with fame. Yet her ending doesn't overshadow her legacy. It sharpens it. Aretha's life proved what black excellence sounds like, what resilience looks like, and how a single voice can lift generations. She left this world the way she lived in it, surrounded by family, dignified and unforgettable. Prince. Prince's death fits the sorrowful pattern behind 40 black celebrities who had the most horrible deaths. Because it wasn't the fall of a fading star, it was the sudden silence of a genius who still felt electrified with purpose. Prince Rogers Nelson was a once-in-a-century musician, singer, songwriter, producer, guitarist, pianist, showman, and rebel. He didn't just make hits, he built worlds. From Purple Rain in 1999 to When Doves Cry and Sign of the Times, he reshaped pop, funk, rock, and R&B with a fearless originality that made every era sound like it had been waiting for him. He won 7 Grammy Awards, an Oscar, a Golden Globe, and sold well over 100 million records worldwide. Yet even with all that brilliance, Prince lived under a pressure most people never see an artist who performed like fire night after night for decades. Behind the velvet suits and stadium lights, Prince carried heavy pain. Years of high-energy shows and relentless touring left him battling chronic hip and body pain, a struggle he kept mostly private. He pushed forward anyway because that's what Prince did. He turned suffering into sound and refused to let weakness define him. But pain can be a quiet trap, especially when treatment becomes routine. In the weeks before his death, there were visible signs he wasn't well. He canceled shows and even required emergency attention after a flight. Still, he tried to keep moving, still thinking about music, still planning what came next. That drive, so beautiful on stage, can become dangerous when the body starts depending on relief to keep up with the mind. On April 21, 2016, Prince was found unresponsive at his Paisley Park estate in Minnesota. He was 57 years old. The cause was ruled an accidental overdose of fentanyl, a powerful synthetic opioid that had entered his system through counterfeit pills. It's one of the cruelest modern tragedies, a man who mastered every instrument in the room, taken by something small enough to fit in a pocket, something that pretended to be safe. The world reacted like a city losing electricity. Lights dimmed everywhere at once. Fans held purple vigils. Artists wept and radio stations sounded like memorials. Prince's death wasn't just the end of a life. It was a warning about pain, privacy, and how even the brightest legends can be vulnerable in the unseen parts of their days. Yet his legacy remains untouchable music that still feels alive, daring, and forever ahead of us. James Brown. James Brown's story sits uneasily in any list of the most horrible deaths because his life was built on survival, reinvention, and sheer force of will. Yet he still met an ending that felt lonely, chaotic, and surrounded by unanswered tension. Born in 1933 in Barnwell, South Carolina, raised in deep poverty and hardship, Brown clawed his way into becoming the godfather of soul. He didn't just perform music, he detonated it. With songs like I Got You, I Feel Good, Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, Sex Machine, and Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. He created funk's blueprint and provided a soundtrack for Black pride during America's most volatile decades. His live shows were legendary endurance marathons, splits, screams, footwork like a machine powered by lightning. By the time the world called him a genius, he had already outworked every label, every doubt, and every ceiling put above him. But the same intensity that made James Brown immortal also fed a life that was often turbulent behind the curtain. Fame didn't soften his edges, it sharpened them. He struggled for years with addiction, paranoia, legal trouble, and accusations of violence, and his personal world could be as stormy as his stage presence was electric. Yet even through that chaos, his influence never faded. Hip-hop sampled his drum breaks endlessly. Pop artists copied his choreography, and generations of performers measured their energy against his. Brown existed as a paradox, a cultural hero and a wounded, complicated man, both at the same time. That contradiction followed him into old age, where health problems began stacking up, and the once invincible engine of his body started to sputter. In late 2006, James Brown was hospitalized in Atlanta with severe pneumonia. At first, there were hopeful reports. Friends said he was alert, even joking as if he might walk out and command another stage. But his condition worsened quickly. On December 25, 2006, Christmas Day, he died at 73 from congestive heart failure related to pneumonia complications. The shock wasn't just that he died, but how abruptly the hardest-working man in show business was stilled. What made his death feel especially grim afterward was the turmoil that followed bitter years-long battles over his estate disputes about medical care and lingering questions from those close to him about whether his final days were handled as they should have been. For a man who gave the world so much rhythm and fire, the ending felt messy and unresolved, yet his legacy remains unstoppable. James Brown didn't simply leave hits behind. He left the pulse of modern music itself. Florence Griffith Joyner. Flo-Jo. Florence Griffith Joyner, forever known as Flo-Jo, is one of those names that still spark awe because her life looked like pure speed and bold color, yet her death arrived with a suddenness that felt brutally unfair. In the late 1980s, she wasn't just winning races. She was rewriting what the human body seemed capable of. At the 1988 Seoul Olympics, Flo-Jo won 3 gold medals, 100 m, 200 m, and 4 100 m relay, and 1 silver, setting a 100-meter world record of 10.49 seconds and a 200-meter world record of 21.34 seconds times that still stand today. She ran not only with power, but with style. One-legged racing suits, 6-inch nails, and a star's confidence that told black girls everywhere, you can be fast, fearless, and unforgettable at the same time. When she retired early, many believed she was simply stepping into a new chapter. No one imagined how short that chapter would be. On the night of September 20th, 1998, Flo-Jo went to sleep in her home in Mission Viejo, California, expecting another ordinary morning. Instead, in the quiet hours before dawn on September 21st, she suffered a catastrophic epileptic seizure. The seizure caused her to stop breathing, a tragedy known medically as asphyxiation, related to seizure activity. She died there in her bed at only 38 years old. There was no long public illness, No farewell tour, no chance for fans to brace themselves. One day, the world's fastest woman was alive, a mother and mentor with plans. The next day, the news hit like a wall. The shock was magnified by how healthy she seemed on the outside, a reminder that even the strongest bodies can carry hidden vulnerabilities. FloJo's death felt horrible because it stole her in stillness in the most human moment imaginable, sleep. It also left behind a storm of confusion and rumor because sudden losses of icons often do. But the verified truth is heartbreaking enough on its own. A rare, violent seizure ended a life that had spent years outrunning limits. What remains is the image of Florence alive, head high, knees driving gold, flashing the track, unable to hold her. Her records are more than numbers. They're a kind of immortality. Yet her ending still whispers the same lesson carried by so many on that tragic list. Glory can be dazzling, but life is fragile, and time is never promised even to the fastest among us. Nat King Cole. Nat King Cole's story carries a special kind of heartbreak because his ending was the opposite of the smooth velvet elegance he gave the world. Born in 1919, he became one of America's most beloved voices, warm, romantic, effortless. Songs like Unforgettable Mona Lisa and The Christmas Song made him a household name, and his success broke barriers for black artists on radio and television. At his peak, Nat was the image of calm mastery, tuxedo, sharp smile, easy voice like a late-night fireplace. But behind that polish was a habit that quietly stalked him for years: heavy smoking. In the early 1960s, when he was still working relentlessly, the damage had already begun. In 1964, Cole collapsed with intense chest pain during a performance. The diagnosis was devastating: advanced lung cancer. In a matter of months, the man who seemed forever composed was pulled into a brutal physical decline. Friends and family watched him shrink rapidly, his once strong frame reduced by dramatic weight loss and exhaustion. He underwent an operation in January 1965 to remove his left lung, a desperate attempt to buy time. Instead, the cancer continued to spread, and the recovery was punishing. The suffering wasn't theatrical. There were no spotlights, no applause, only hospital nights, labored breathing, and the slow stripping away of the very instrument that defined him. For someone whose voice had soothed millions, losing breath meant losing identity. And that is one of the cruelest kinds of horror. Nat King Cole died in Santa Monica, California on February 15, 1965, at just 45 years old. The shock wasn't only his age, but the vivid contrast between who he had been on stage and what the illness did to him in the end. A star who once carried himself like royalty spent his final days in sterile rooms, weakened by pain and the limits of mid-century medicine. His death left a deep scar in black entertainment history, a reminder that even the most radiant figures can be taken by a quiet, relentless enemy. Yet in that tragedy, something enduring remains. Nat's recordings still sound alive, still tender, still impossibly human, as if his voice refused to accept the ending his body was forced to meet. John Coltrane. John Coltrane's death is one of the most haunting chapters in the story of black legends, lost too soon because it stole a man who was still climbing toward new musical heavens. Coltrane wasn't merely a jazz saxophonist, he was a spiritual force. By the early 1960s, he had already changed the language of jazz with his fierce improvisation, rapid sheets of sound, and a style that felt like prayer set on fire. Albums like Giant Steps and My Favorite Things made him a star, but A Love Supreme turned him into a prophet, a man searching for God through breath, melody, and struggle. Younger musicians followed him like students. Older ones respected him like a peer who had gone somewhere they hadn't dared to go. Just when the world was beginning to understand how far his mind could stretch, his body began to betray him. In 1967, Coltrane was only 40, but he had been living at a pace that burned through strength. Years of grueling touring past heroin and alcohol addiction which he had fought and escaped, and the relentless pressure to innovate had taken a toll. That summer he began suffering severe abdominal pain. Doctors diagnosed him with liver cancer, then one of the most frightening and least treatable diagnoses imaginable. The illness moved fast. Friends describe him wasting away, losing weight rapidly, his skin turning sallow, his energy collapsing. The cruelty was not only physical, but artistic. A man whose life depended on breath and control now found his body tightening against him. He reportedly resisted chemotherapy because he didn't want treatments that might steal what little clarity and strength he had left to compose. Even sick, he was still thinking about music, still reaching for another sound, another truth, another message he could leave behind. On July 17, 1967, John Coltrane died in a hospital on Long Island. No stage lights, no roaring crowd, just a quiet room where a genius slipped away far earlier than anyone could accept. The horror of his death sits in the contrast. The man who could make a saxophone cry, shout, and soar to the edge of the universe was silenced by a disease he couldn't outplay. Yet his final years also carry a strange kind of victory. Coltrane left behind not just records, but a path proof that black creativity could be endlessly daring, intellectual, spiritual, and free. His passing ended a life, but it didn't end the journey he started. Every time a saxophone wails with searching intensity, you can still hear him there asking the world to listen deeper. Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor's death feels especially tragic because his genius was built on turning pain into laughter. And in the end, pain had the final word. Born in 1940 in Peoria, Illinois, Pryor rose from a childhood marked by poverty and trauma to become one of the most important comedians America has ever produced. He didn't just tell jokes, he told the truth in a way that cut deep and healed at the same time. With landmark work like Live on the Sunset Strip and films such as Stir Crazy Silver Streak and Brewster's Millions, he redefined stand-up for a generation. Richard made America laugh at the things it didn't want to face. Racism, addiction, hypocrisy, heartbreak, because he had lived them. But the same life that fueled his brilliance also put him on a collision course with a devastating physical decline. The most terrifying moment of Pryor's life came long before his final day. In 1980, during a severe crack cocaine binge, he suffered a psychotic episode and set himself on fire running through the street engulfed in flames. He survived, but the burns were catastrophic, leaving permanent scars across his body and psyche. It was a turning point that revealed how close his demons had come to killing him. Even after recovery, his health never fully stabilized. Over the years, Pryor battled addiction, multiple surgeries, and worsening neurological symptoms. By the late 1980s, he had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a disease that slowly stripped away his mobility. The man who once owned the stage with restless energy and fearless pacing found himself increasingly confined first to a cane, then to a wheelchair. His voice, still sharp and funny, had to fight through a body that no longer obeyed him. Richard Pryor died on December 10, 2005, at 65 years old from a heart attack in Los Angeles. The horror of his death isn't about a single shocking headline, it's the long arc of suffering behind it. He survived fire addiction and relentless illness, yet spent his final years battling a body that kept tightening its grip. Still, Pryor's ending doesn't define him. What defines him is what he left behind: a blueprint for honesty in comedy, a voice that opened doors for generations of black artists, and a legacy that proved laughter can be both a weapon and a refuge. Even in tragedy, Richard Pryor remains what he always was: unstoppable truth in human form. Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy Davis Jr.'s final chapter is one of those stories that makes the title "The Most Horrible Deaths" feel painfully real, because his ending wasn't only about a disease, it was about watching a man who once seemed unstoppable get slowly stripped of everything that made him sparkle. Sammy was the ultimate showman, singer, dancer, actor, comedian, and a Rat Pack icon who could light up a room in seconds. He fought his way into spaces that didn't want a black man there, and through sheer talent made them clap anyway. By the 1960s and 70s, Sammy wasn't just famous. He was a symbol of black excellence, surviving in the belly of old Hollywood. His performances felt effortless, like joy in motion. That's why what happened to him at the end landed like a gut punch. In 1989, Sammy began to notice he couldn't sing the way he always had. The voice that had carried the Candyman and Mr. Bojangles across generations started to betray him. Doctors diagnosed him with throat cancer. The treatment was brutal. Radiation and surgery ravaged his body, leaving him weak, gaunt, and struggling to swallow. For a man who lived through his voice, who could improvise a melody, a joke, a dance step on command, having breath and speech stolen, felt like a cruel kind of imprisonment. His weight plummeted, and the once bursting energy that defined him turned into exhaustion. He couldn't hide even when he tried. Yet he kept pushing forward in public, partly out of pride and partly out of necessity. That necessity is the quiet heartbreak people often forget. Sammy's fame had come with a high-rolling lifestyle, lavish spending, gambling, and a circle that moved fast and lived big. By his final years, he was drowning in debt, reportedly in the tens of millions, and the financial pressure never let up. As his health collapsed, his possessions were sold off, his world shrinking as quickly as his body. On May 16, 1990, Sammy Davis Jr. died at 64 in Beverly Hills. The horror of his death isn't in a single violent moment. It's in the contrast. A man who once commanded Las Vegas stages and Hollywood spotlights ended his life weakened by cancer and haunted by money troubles far from the roar of the crowd that once kept him alive. Still, his legacy remains luminous. Sammy proved that talent could break doors open, and even in his darkest ending, that light never truly went out. Luther Vandross. Luther Vandross's story is heartbreaking in a way that feels almost unfair, because his voice was built for love songs and soft landings, not for the slow, punishing goodbye that took him from the world. By the time he became a household name in the 1980s, Luther had already spent years behind the curtain writing, arranging, and singing backup for stars like David Bowie, Roberta Flack, and Chaka Khan. Then he stepped into the spotlight and never let go of it. Hits like Never Too Much, Here and Now, A House Is Not a Home, and later Dance with My Father made him the defining R&B balladeer of his era. He won 8 Grammy Awards, sold tens of millions of records, and became the soundtrack to weddings, anniversaries, and every quiet moment when people needed music to say what words couldn't. But Luther's private battles were heavy. He lived under enormous pressure, creative, physical, emotional. For years, he struggled with weight diabetes and high blood pressure conditions that are common but dangerous, especially under the stress of constant performing and touring. Friends and collaborators often described him as intensely dedicated, almost relentless in the studio, pushing for perfection because he knew what his music meant to people. That drive built greatness, but it also wore on his body. And then came the turning point on April 16, 2003. Luther suffered a major stroke at his home in New York City. He was only 52. The stroke left him with significant damage, difficulty speaking, limited movement, and a long, uncertain road of therapy. For a man whose life was his voice, the stroke was not just a medical crisis. It was a devastating theft of identity. He fought hard to return. The world saw flashes of his resilience. He even won Song of the Year at the Grammys for Dance with My Father, while still recovering a moment that felt like triumph against fate. But recovery from a severe stroke is a marathon, not a miracle. Complications kept coming, and his body never regained the strength it once had. On July 1, 2005, Luther Vandross died in New Jersey from complications related to that stroke. He was 54 years old. The tragedy of his death isn't loud or sensational. It's the heartbreak of a slow fade of watching a once limitless voice trapped inside a body that could no longer carry it. Yet his legacy remains untouchable. When Luther sings, it still feels like warmth entering the room, like someone you love calling your name. XX Tentacion. XXXTentacion's death is one of the most shocking modern chapters in the story of Black fame cut down too early, because it happened in broad daylight at the height of a career that was still unfolding. Born José Duane Ricardo Onfroy on January 23, 1998, in Plantation, Florida, he rose fast from a turbulent childhood into the SoundCloud era's most polarizing star. In just a few years, he turned raw emotion into a new musical language mixing rap rock and aching confession, so that albums like 17, 2017, and 2018 became a lifeline for millions of young listeners. His songs were haunted, vulnerable, and intense, and even people who didn't love the style could feel the force of it. At the same time, his life was publicly complicated. He faced serious legal accusations and a reputation for volatility, which made him both fiercely defended and fiercely criticized. That tension between artistic pain and personal turmoil hung around him like a storm cloud, even as he started speaking about change, healing, and doing better. On June 18, 2018, that storm ended in a way no one could rewind. Around 3:56 p.m., XXXTentacion left a motorcycle dealership in Deerfield Beach, Florida, carrying a designer bag that reportedly held about $50,000. As he sat in his BMW, he was ambushed in what authorities later described as a robbery. He was shot and died shortly after, only 20 years old. The scene stunned the public because it wasn't a late-night alley or a hidden feud. It was a bright afternoon in a busy area, a reminder that violence doesn't need darkness to strike. The case went to trial, and in 2023, 3 men were convicted of first-degree murder and robbery, receiving life sentences without parole. A 4th man pleaded guilty and testified. Even with convictions, that moment still feels unreal to fans because it erased a life that had not reached its second act. What makes XXXTentacion's death especially horrible is the timing and the unresolved what if. He was a father-to-be. His son, Gekume Onfroy, was born 7 months later in January 2019. He was also an artist at a crossroads, someone whose work told the truth about despair, yet who seemed to be reaching for a better version of himself. His legacy remains complicated, and it should be. We don't honor truth by pretending his life was simple. But we also don't honor truth by pretending his death was anything less than tragic. In the end, XXXTentacion became another reminder that talent is not armor, and the distance between a rising legend and a silent headline can be only a few seconds long. Jam Master Jay Run DMC. Jam Master Jay, born Jason Mizell, wasn't just the DJ of Run DMC. He was the heartbeat of one of hip-hop's most important groups. In the 1980s, Run DMC didn't merely cross over, they kicked doors open for black music on MTV radio and global stages, with Jay's turntables as the engine behind that revolution. By the early 2000s, even after the group's peak era, Mizell remained a respected mentor and businessman, running 24/7 studios in Queens, New York, helping younger artists find their sound. To fans, he was a living bridge between hip-hop's foundation and its future, someone who had already survived the industry's turbulence and seemed destined to keep guiding it. That's why the night of October 30th, 2002, still feels like a punch to the culture. Inside his own studio in Hollis, Queens, Jam Master Jay was shot and killed in what investigators later described as an execution-style attack. He was 37 years old. The horror wasn't just the violence, it was the setting a creative sanctuary turned into a crime scene, a safe room where music was supposed to be born, becoming the place where a legend was erased. For nearly 2 decades, the murder hung over hip-hop like an unsolved ghost story. Rumors swirled about old feuds, drug-related disputes, betrayal by people close to him, but nothing firm arrived. The silence after his death wasn't only personal. It felt historical, as if the genre lost one of its architects in the most violating way possible, right at home, right at work, right in front of people who knew him. After years of stalled leads, the case finally moved. In 2020, 2 men were charged. In 2023, a third suspect was added. Then in February 2024, a federal jury convicted Carl Jordan Jr. and Ronald Washington of murdering Jam Master Jay in connection with narcotics trafficking. Sentencing is still pending, and the third defendant's case remains separate and ongoing. Justice arrived late, but it arrived with a heavy truth. Even pioneers can be caught in the crossfire of streets business and trust gone wrong. Jam Master Jay's death was horrific because it stole a founder before he could finish building what he was still shaping. Yet his legacy survives in every scratch, every DJ who treats turntables like an instrument, and every hip-hop fan who knows the culture was changed forever by the man behind the decks. Isaac Hayes. Isaac Hayes is one of those legends whose death feels especially cruel because it came just when many believed he had earned the right to slow down and simply live. Born on August 20th, 1942 in Covington, Tennessee, Hayes didn't just sing soul and funk, he helped design the sound of an era. At Stax Records, he co-wrote classic hits for Sam and Dave, and others, then exploded as a solo artist with Hot Buttered Soul 1969, stretching soul music into bold cinematic territory. His deep velvet baritone and orchestral arrangements made him larger than life, but his defining mainstream breakthrough came with Theme from Shaft 1971. The song won him an Academy Award for Best Original Song and multiple Grammys, making Hayes a symbol of black creativity and power in film and music. Decades later, his influence only grew. Funk lovers revered him, and hip-hop producers endlessly sampled his grooves. He was elegant swagger and genius in one frame. Yet behind that towering public image, Hayes had been fighting serious health problems. In 2006, he suffered a stroke that signaled ongoing cardiovascular danger, especially tied to chronic high blood pressure. He worked through it anyway, continuing to record and appear publicly as if determination could outpace biology. That's the quiet tragedy in so many great artists' stories. Their spirit stays unstoppable long after the body begins to warn them. Hayes was still active, still respected as a mentor and cultural icon, still carrying the weight of his legacy forward until the body's limits arrived without negotiation. On August 10, 2008, Isaac Hayes was found unconscious in his Memphis home near a treadmill that was still running. He was rushed to the hospital but died later that day at 65 years old. The official cause was a recurrent stroke linked to hypertension. What makes his death feel so heartbreaking isn't spectacle, it's contrast. A man who once filled the world with thunderous funk and cinematic soul slipped away in silence, taken by an invisible enemy that doesn't care about fame or genius. Still, Hayes didn't truly leave. His voice lives in every slow burn soul record, every funk bass line, and every hip-hop track that borrows his sound to keep the legacy breathing. Charlie Parker. Charlie Bird Parker's story is one of the most haunting in black music history because his death didn't arrive as a single shock. It was the final collapse of a genius who burned too hard, too fast. Born in Kansas City in 1920, Parker became the architect of bebop, the man who turned jazz into a new language of speed, complexity, and fierce emotional truth. With a saxophone in his hands, he sounded like a mind racing ahead of the world. Records like Coco Ornithology and Now's the Time didn't just entertain, they rewired modern music, influencing everyone from Miles Davis to the DNA of hip-hop improvisation. But the brilliance came with a brutal underside, a life shaped by poverty, racism, non-stop touring, and addiction that gripped him early and never fully let go. By the early 1950s, Parker's body was paying the price for years of heroin use, heavy drinking, and exhaustion. Friends described him as exhausted beyond his age, often sick, coughing blood and struggling to stay upright between gigs. The pressures were not only physical. He carried deep personal grief, including the death of his young daughter in 1954, which pushed him further into despair. Even as his music remained supernatural, his health was collapsing in public. He kept performing, kept composing, kept trying to outrun his own demons. But the pace of his life had become unsustainable. On March 12, 1955, Parker was staying at the New York apartment of Baroness Panonica de Koenigswarter, a jazz patron and close friend. He became violently ill, suffering breathing problems and a severe coughing fit. He died later that day, at only 34 years old. The tragedy was so stark that when doctors arrived, they reportedly assumed he was in his 50s because his body was so ravaged. Charlie Parker's death felt horrible, not for spectacle, but for the sheer waste of time a visionary taken while his mind was still overflowing with music. Yet his legacy refuses to die. Every restless saxophone run, every jazz solo that risks the edge still carries Bird's shadow proof that even a short life can change the world forever. Fred Hampton. Fred Hampton's death remains one of the most chilling, horrible losses in modern Black history because it wasn't an accident or a private downfall. It was a violent erasure of a young man whose power was rising too fast for America to ignore. Born on August 30th, 1948, in the Chicago suburb of Summit Hampton, was a natural leader, long before most people finish figuring out who they are. By his late teens, he was organizing for civil rights, and by 21, he had become chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party. What made Hampton extraordinary wasn't just his courage, it was his strategy. He built the Rainbow Coalition, uniting Black communities with Latino groups and poor white working-class organizations. In a city built on racial division, he was doing something dangerous, proving solidarity could be stronger than fear. His speeches were electric, but also practical. He fed children, organized health programs, taught political education, and pushed people to see themselves as worthy of dignity. That kind of influence drew heat. Hampton came under intense surveillance by law enforcement, especially through the FBI's COINTELPRO program, which targeted Black activists across the country. Agents viewed him as a future threat not because he carried a gun, but because he carried hope, organized, disciplined hope. In the months before his death, Hampton was repeatedly harassed, arrested, and shadowed. Still, he refused to stop. He understood the risk, but he also understood the moment the Panthers weren't just protesting, they were building institutions of survival. Hampton believed you could not fight racism, only with unity and power rooted in community. That belief made him not only popular, but terrifying to those invested in the status quo. In the pre-dawn hours of December 4th, 1969, that terror turned into a raid. Around 4:45 a.m., police stormed the West Side Chicago apartment where Hampton was sleeping beside his pregnant partner Deborah Johnson, later Akua Njeri. According to survivors and later investigations, Hampton had been drugged the night before, leaving him unable to wake or defend himself. Shots exploded through the apartment, nearly 100 rounds in seconds. Chaos screams and splintering walls filled the rooms. Hampton was hit multiple times while still in bed. Witnesses said he was alive after the first barrage but was then shot again at close range. He died at 21 years old. The apartment became a bullet-riddled tomb, and a leadership future was wiped out before sunrise. The horror of Fred Hampton's death is in the betrayal of it, a young man preaching community uplift killed in his sleep, long before he could fully become what he was clearly destined to be. Yet his legacy never surrendered. Hampton's words still circulate like a heartbeat about serving the people, about unity across lines meant to divide us, about the kind of revolution that starts with breakfast programs and ends with freedom. They took his life, but they could not take the future he made people believe was possible. Naya Rivera, Afro-Latina. Naya Rivera's story hits with a special kind of heartbreak because it blends bright talent, cultural significance, and a final act of pure motherhood. Born on January 12, 1987 in California, Naya was Afro-Latina of African American and Puerto Rican heritage, and she carried that identity into spaces where visibility was still rare. She began acting as a child, but the world truly met her as Santana Lopez on Glee. Santana wasn't just a fan-favorite character. She was a breakthrough, one of the most visible queer Latina figures on mainstream TV, played with sharp wit, vulnerability, and fire. For many viewers, especially black and brown girls and LGBTQ+ teens, Naya's Santana was the first time they saw someone like themselves centered on a major show. On July 8, 2020, that life was taken in a way no one could process. Naya and her 4-year-old son Josie rented a pontoon boat on Lake Piru in Ventura County, California. They went swimming together, but the wind and current began pulling the boat away from them. In that sudden danger, Naya focused on one thing: getting her child to safety. She used her strength to lift Josie back onto the boat. He later told authorities that his mom helped him up, and then he saw her disappear beneath the water. When rescuers arrived, Josie was found alone on the boat, safe in his life jacket, waiting for the mother who had just saved him. Naya's body was recovered 5 days later, and her death was ruled an accidental drowning. She was 33 years old. What makes this loss so devastating isn't spectacle or scandal, it's meaning. She didn't die chasing fame or thrills. She died in a moment of protection, giving her son the gift of life at the cost of her own. The world lost an Afro-Latina trailblazer and a fearless performer, but the way she left reminds us of the deepest kind of love, the kind that doesn't hesitate. Her legacy lives in her work and the representation she expanded, and in the boy who is alive because his mother's last instinct was to save him. Heavy D. Heavy D's death feels especially tragic because it came to someone who built his whole career on joy. Born Dwight Arrington Myers on May 24, 1967 in Mandeville, Jamaica, and raised in Mount Vernon, New York, Heavy D burst into hip-hop in the late 80s as the larger-than-life leader of Heavy D and the Boys. At a time when rap was often cast as hard-edged and confrontational, Heavy brought something different: warmth, humor, dancing, and a bright, radio-friendly swagger that still felt authentically hip-hop. His hits like Now That We Found Love, Somebody for Me and Is It Good to You didn't just move charts, they moved people. He was the guy who could make a whole room smile, a bridge between rap, R&B, and pop, and later a respected actor and producer who stayed beloved across generations. But behind that upbeat public image, his health was quietly under strain. In the early 2010s, Heavy D had been dealing with ongoing medical issues, including heart-related problems, though he kept working and showing up with the same easy charm fans knew. On November 7, 2011, after returning from a trip, he experienced sudden breathing difficulties and collapsed outside his Beverly Hills home. He was rushed to the hospital but died the next day at only 44 years old. The official cause was a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in the lung compounded by pneumonia. It's one of those medical tragedies that feels especially cruel because it can strike fast and without warning, even in someone who seemed full of life hours earlier. Heavy D's passing hit like a cold silence after a party song ends. Hip-hop lost one of its earliest ambassadors of happiness, a man who proved that rap could be playful, romantic, and still powerful. His death also served as a reminder that even the most energetic, laughing spirits aren't immune to sudden illness. But his legacy hasn't dimmed every time a 90s groove kicks in, every time hip-hop makes room for fun without losing soul. You can still feel Heavy D's light bouncing in the beat. Dinah Washington. Dinah Washington's death is one of those tragedies that feels especially cruel because it silenced a woman whose voice had already survived so much. Born Ruth Lee Jones on August 29, 1924 in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, she rose from gospel beginnings to become the queen of the blues. By the 1950s, Dinah was a giant, effortlessly gliding between blues, jazz, and pop, shaping the sound of an era with hits like What a Difference a Day Makes This Bitter Earth and Unforgettable. She won a Grammy-packed theaters and carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew she belonged at the center of American music. But behind the glamour, Dinah's life was a constant storm, exhausting tour schedules, intense relationships, pressure to stay thin, and the emotional cost of being a black woman expected to be dazzling every night, regardless of what she felt inside. By late 1963, that pressure was mixing with something even more dangerous, substances used to push the body past its limits. Dinah had been using prescription sedatives and diet pills, a common but risky reality in the entertainment world at the time. Friends later described how hard she worked to maintain an image while fighting fatigue and stress. On the night of December 13, 1963, she was in Detroit with her husband, NFL star Dick Night Train Lane. The next morning, December 14th, Dinah was found unresponsive in her bedroom. She was only 39 years old. The official cause of death was an accidental overdose from a lethal combination of barbiturates and other prescription drugs, reportedly intensified by alcohol. What makes Dinah Washington's death so heartbreaking isn't only that it was preventable, it's the way it exposes the invisible costs of stardom. Her voice could fill a room with heat and heartbreak, yet her final moments happened far from a stage in silence, with no chance for an encore. Dinah's passing also left a painful lesson about an era that chewed through black talent while offering little protection for their health or peace of mind. Still, her legacy refuses to fade. The elegance in her phrasing, the force in her blues, the way she could sound both tender and unstoppable in the same line, those things outlived the tragedy. Dinah Washington didn't just sing the blues, she became one of its eternal definitions. Alvin Ailey. Alvin Ailey's death is remembered as one of the most heartbreaking in black cultural history, because it wasn't only the loss of a man, it was the loss of a movement still unfolding. Born on January 5, 1931 in Rogers, Texas, Ailey rose from the harsh realities of the segregated South to become the visionary who reshaped modern dance. In 1958, he founded the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater, a company that didn't just perform, it testified. Works like Revelations 1960 became spiritual landmarks, turning black memory, gospel struggle, and hope into motion so powerful it felt like breathing. Ailey gave black dancers a world-class stage when the world still tried to keep them in the shadows, and he built a home where their stories were not extras, but the center of the human experience. But behind the global acclaim, Ailey carried a private battle that grew heavier as the 1980s progressed. In an era when AIDS was surrounded by fear, stigma, and silence, especially within black communities and the arts, Ailey chose to keep his illness largely private. Friends said he continued working even as his body weakened, pushing through rehearsals and planning seasons while enduring infections and the relentless toll of the disease. The tragedy of AIDS at that time was not only medical, it was social. Many people suffered alone, afraid of how the world would judge them. For someone as celebrated as Ailey, that loneliness was especially cruel, a man who gave the world beauty and belonging, forced to fight for breath in secrecy. On December 1, 1989, Alvin Ailey died in New York City at 58 years old from complications related to AIDS. What makes his death feel so devastating is the contrast between his life's work and his final chapter. A creator who spent decades lifting black bodies into freedom was ultimately trapped by a sickness that society treated with shame instead of compassion. Yet Ailey's legacy didn't die with him. His company continues touring the globe. Revelations still brings audiences to their feet, and generations of dancers still find their identity through the space he carved open. His ending was tragic, but his impact remains a living, moving force, proof that even when the body falls, the art can keep rising. Roger Troutman Zapp. Roger Troutman's death is one of the most shocking and painful losses in black music history because it mixed genius family tension and sudden violence in a single morning. Born on November 29, 1951 in Hamilton, Ohio, Roger wasn't just the frontman of Zapp, he was a musical inventor. His futuristic talkbox sound made funk feel like it came from tomorrow, driving classics like More Bounce to the Ounce Computer Love and I Can Make You Dance. Long before hip-hop became the dominant voice of the culture, Roger's grooves were already shaping it. West Coast rap G-funk and modern R&B borrowed his bass lines and vocal effects endlessly. When his talk box lit up Tupac's California Love, a whole younger generation learned his name. Roger had that rare kind of talent that doesn't just make hits, it creates a new language. But behind the music, the Troutman family was under strain. By the late 1990s, business pressures and money disputes were reportedly building inside the tight circle of brothers who had carried Zapp's legacy together. Roger's older brother, Larry Troutman, the group's longtime manager, was closely tied to those financial and managerial tensions. Whatever the exact trigger, the pressure reached a breaking point in the most tragic way possible inside the family itself. When success and stress collide in the same house, love can turn into resentment, and trust can fracture where it should have been safest. On April 25, 1999, outside Roger's recording studio in Dayton, Ohio, he was shot multiple times and rushed to the hospital. He died soon after, only 47 years old. Hours later, Larry Troutman was found dead in a car nearby from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, and authorities concluded it was a murder-suicide. The horror of Roger's death isn't just the fact that he was killed, it's where it happened and who was involved. A studio meant for creating music became the doorstep of his final breath, and the bond of blood became the weapon that ended him. It felt like the cruelest contradiction. A man whose sound brought people together was taken by the very circle that once built his dream. Yet Roger Troutman didn't leave behind silence. His talkbox still hums through speakers worldwide. His melodies still bounce through hip-hop and funk like a heartbeat that refuses to stop. Even with such a brutal ending, his influence remains alive, proof that genius can outlast tragedy, and that the music he created is still doing what he always wanted it to do: move the world. DMX. DMX was more than a rapper. He was a living storm of truth, pain, and survival that shook hip-hop at its core. Born Earl Simmons in 1970 in Yonkers, New York, he rose from a brutal childhood into superstardom with a voice that sounded like it had fought its way out of darkness. When he burst onto the scene in the late 1990s, the industry had never heard anything like him: raw, spiritual, furious, and heartbreakingly honest. Albums like It's Dark and Hell is Hot, Flesh of My Flesh, Blood of My Blood, and then there was X didn't just sell, they defined an era. DMX made history with 5 consecutive #1 album debuts on the Billboard 200, a rare achievement that stamped him as a generational force. Songs such as Rough Riders' anthem Party Up Up in Here and X Gon' Give It To You became anthems not because they were polished, but because they bled real-life rage, faith struggle, loyalty, and the relentless desire to keep standing. Yet the same honesty that fueled his music also revealed the war he was fighting inside himself. DMX battled addiction for years, and it wasn't a quiet battle hidden away from public view. It played out on headlines, court dates, rehab attempts, and comeback stages over and over. He carried deep wounds from childhood trauma, instability, and betrayal, and fame didn't erase them. It magnified them. Still, what made DMX unforgettable was his refusal to pretend he was okay. He prayed in public, cried in interviews, and kept trying to climb toward a better version of himself. He spoke often about God, about wanting peace, about his children, 15 in total, and about being tired of losing to the same demons. Fans didn't just watch his career. They watched a human being wrestling for his life in real time, hoping each new recovery would finally be the turning point. Then, in early April 2021, the fight ended in a way that felt brutally sudden. On April 2nd, DMX suffered cardiac arrest at home and was rushed to a hospital in White Plains, New York. He was placed on life support, and for days the world waited, praying for the miracle he had chased so many times before. But on April 9th, he died at 50. The official cause was a heart attack triggered by acute cocaine intoxication, which cut off oxygen to his brain and left no path back. The tragedy sits in the contrast. A man whose voice sounded indestructible was taken by a silent collapse behind closed doors. Yet DMX didn't leave behind silence. He left a legacy of fearless vulnerability music that still feels like a clenched fist and an open prayer, and a reminder that even the most fire-blooded legends are human, fragile, complicated, and worth remembering in full. Don Cornelius Soul Train. Don Cornelius was the kind of man who didn't just host a show, he built a cultural home. Born on September 27, 1936 in Chicago, he rose from a working-class upbringing into television at a time when black faces were rarely allowed to shape mainstream entertainment. His creation Soul Train first aired nationally in 1971 and quickly became a lifeline of black music fashion and pride years before MTV ever existed. Week after week, Cornelius's calm baritone and sharp style introduced America to the living pulse of R&B, funk, soul, and later hip-hop. He wasn't chasing trends, he was making them visible. For more than 2 decades as host and producer, he gave countless black artists their first national spotlight, and millions of viewers a message that felt revolutionary in its simplicity. Black culture is beautiful, creative, and worth celebrating on its own terms. But behind that polished presence was a man quietly carrying pain that most fans never saw. Cornelius had faced serious health challenges for years, including complications tied to a major brain surgery in the 1980s. Over time, seizures and chronic discomfort reportedly became part of his daily life. Add to that the pressures of aging, high-stakes business battles and personal strain, and the burden grew heavier than his public smile could reveal. Those close to him later described him as battling not only physical suffering, but deep emotional exhaustion. It's one of the cruel truths of fame: the world keeps applauding the image, while the person inside it may be unraveling in silence. In the early morning of February 1, 2012, Don Cornelius was found at his home in Los Angeles with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was 75 years old. The shock wasn't just the loss, it was the contrast. A man who had spent his life broadcasting joy, rhythm, and love, peace and soul, left the world in a moment of despair. His death opened a painful conversation about how chronic illness and depression can corner even the strongest spirits, especially those who feel they must stay dignified and unbreakable. Yet Cornelius's legacy doesn't end in tragedy. Every time a classic Soul Train line dance resurfaces, every time black music is centered without apology, his work keeps moving alive in the culture he helped the world finally see. Eddie Kendricks. The Temptations. Eddie Kendricks' final chapter is heartbreaking because it silenced one of the sweetest, most instantly recognizable voices in soul music just as he was still fighting to stay alive. Born on December 17, 1939 in Union Springs, Alabama, Kendricks became the falsetto soul of the Temptations, helping found the group and leading some of their most beloved classics. When you hear that soaring, airy tenderness in songs like The Way You Do, The Things You Do, Get Ready, and especially Just My Imagination, Running Away With Me, you're hearing Eddie's signature light as smoke but emotionally direct. His voice helped define the Motown romantic sound of the 1960s, giving black music a polished, irresistible elegance that crossed every racial and cultural line in America. But behind that velvet falsetto, a quiet danger was growing. Kendricks had spent years smoking heavily, and by the early 1990s, his health began to unravel. He was diagnosed with lung cancer, a disease that attacks the very thing a singer depends on most, the breath. Doctors removed one of his lungs in 1991 in a desperate attempt to stop the cancer's spread. Even after surgery, he kept pushing himself to perform, driven by pride, devotion to the stage, and the need to remain the artist he had always been. Friends and fans watched him weaken, yet he still tried to sing through the exhaustion and pain, as if sheer will could hold back a storm already inside his body. On October 5, 1992, Eddie Kendricks died in Birmingham, Alabama at only 52 years old. The tragedy isn't a sudden headline of violence, it's the slow cruelty of a sickness that tightens day by day, turning breathing into a battle. For a man whose gift was making love songs float like sunlight, dying from a disease that steals air feels especially cruel. Yet Kendricks didn't leave in silence. His voice is still alive in every Temptations harmony, forever reminding listeners what soul sounds like when it's tender, fearless, and timeless. Gary Coleman. Gary Coleman's life already carried a weight most people could never imagine, which is why his death felt so cruel, like the final blow in a story that had given him too few chances to breathe. Born on February 8, 1968 in Zion, Illinois, Coleman became America's most beloved child star as Arnold Jackson on Diff'rent Strokes, 1978 to 1986. His catchphrase, wide-eyed charm, and perfect comedic timing turned him into a household name. But even at the height of that fame, his body was fighting a lifelong war. Since childhood, he had suffered from a congenital kidney disease that required major medical treatment and left him physically fragile for decades. The illness stunted his growth, affected his overall health, and followed him into adulthood. Fame gave him visibility, but it never gave him a normal life or the protection people assume stardom brings. As the years passed, the contrast between his childhood glory and adult reality became painfully clear. Financial exploitation lawsuits and unstable personal relationships kept him in headlines for reasons far removed from the joy he once brought to TV screens. His health remained delicate, and by 2010, he was still dealing with the physical toll of a lifetime of illness. Then came the accident that ended everything. On May 26, 2010, Gary reportedly fell at his home in Santaquin, Utah, striking his head and suffering a severe brain hemorrhage. He was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. For a short time, he was said to be conscious, but his condition deteriorated rapidly. On May 28, 2010, Gary Coleman died at just 42 years old. Authorities ruled his death accidental, caused by the head injury from the fall. What makes his passing feel especially horrible isn't only the suddenness, it's the sadness of the full arc. A man who once made millions laugh ended his life far from Hollywood, physically vulnerable, and still shadowed by hardships that started long before he was famous. His legacy is complicated, but his story remains a stark reminder that childhood fame can be bright and brief, while the vulnerabilities behind it can last a lifetime. Bobbi Kristina Brown. Bobbi Kristina Brown's story is one of the most unsettling modern tragedies in Black celebrity history because it unfolded like a cruel echo of the past, only with even less time to escape it. Born on March 4, 1993, she was the only child of two global music giants, Whitney Houston and Bobby Brown, so her life began under a spotlight that never really dimmed. As a kid, she was often seen beside her mother at awards shows and red carpets, becoming a familiar face long before she had a chance to decide who she wanted to be. She appeared on reality television, tried to step toward music and acting, and carried the complicated pressure of being the next chapter of a legendary family. But after Whitney Houston's death in 2012, Bobbi Kristina was thrust into grief in public view, and the world watched her struggle to stay grounded while mourning a mother whose presence had been her emotional center. That pressure collided with a personal life that was increasingly unstable. She was in a turbulent relationship with Nick Gordon, a man who had been raised around the Houston Brown household, and there were repeated concerns from family and friends about her safety, mental well-being, and substance use. The situation grew darker behind closed doors, even as headlines tried to piece together what was happening. Then, on January 31, 2015, Bobbi Kristina was found face down and unresponsive in a bathtub at her home in Georgia. She was alive when paramedics arrived, but the damage was severe. Doctors placed her in a medically induced coma, and for nearly 6 months, she never regained meaningful consciousness. The grimness of it wasn't just the medical crisis. It was the eerie similarity to Whitney's own death only 3 years earlier, a parallel that made the entire situation feel like a family curse playing out in real time. On July 26, 2015, Bobbi Kristina died at just 22 years old after being moved to hospice care. Investigators later said that drugs were involved, and the drowning and subsequent brain injury led to fatal complications. Her passing closed a devastating circle in one of music's most storied families, leaving the public stunned not only by how young she was, but by how preventable the chain of events felt. Bobbi Kristina didn't get the chance to fully become herself outside her parents' shadows. Her death remains a heartbreaking reminder that fame can magnify grief, and that sometimes the most horrible endings come not from a single moment, but from a slow collapse no one stops in time. Anthony Mason. Anthony Mason's story is a different kind of heartbreak, one rooted not in a single violent moment, but in a long, grinding decline that stole a warrior's body far too early. Born on December 14, 1966 in Miami, and raised in Queens, New York, Mason fought his way into the NBA the hard way. He wasn't a polished prodigy handed a spotlight, he clawed for it. By the early 1990s, he became the muscle and heartbeat of the New York Knicks, a bruising forward with a granite frame, fearless defense, and surprising playmaking skill. Knicks fans loved him because he played like the city felt, tough, relentless, and proud. In 1995, he won NBA Sixth Man of the Year, later made an All-Star team in 2001, and carved out a reputation as one of the most intimidating, hard-working enforcers of that era. Off the court, he was known for his loyalty, his swagger, and his devotion to family, especially to his son, Anthony Mason Jr., who followed him into basketball. But after retirement, Mason's health began slipping in ways that didn't match the image fans had of him as indestructible. He developed serious heart problems, and by early 2015, he was battling congestive heart failure. For someone whose life had been powered by stamina and physical dominance, heart failure is a cruel enemy. It doesn't just weaken you, it shrinks your world day by day. He reportedly underwent multiple medical procedures fighting to stabilize his condition, but his body had already taken years of pounding on NBA hardwood, and the damage was catching up fast. The decline was sudden enough to shock people who had seen him as a symbol of strength, yet slow enough to be agonizing for those close to him, watching the fight up close. On February 28, 2015, Anthony Mason died at only 48 years old, just 2 weeks shy of his birthday. The tragedy of his death sits in that contrast, a man once defined by power and endurance, brought down by a silent illness that doesn't care how strong you used to be. For fans of 1990s basketball, his passing felt like losing a piece of an era, one of those gritty, unbreakable figures who made the game feel like battle. And yet Mason's legacy remains clear. He was proof that toughness can be talent, that loyalty can be greatness, and that some of the hardest playing hearts still leave the court too soon. Shirley Hemphill. Shirley Hemphill's story is a quiet kind of tragedy. No headlines of violence, no public scandal at the end, just a beloved black pioneer disappearing in silence. Born on July 1, 1947 in Asheville, North Carolina, Shirley chased comedy at a time when black women had to fight twice as hard to be heard. She broke through in the 1970s with a fearless stand-up style and a voice that didn't soften itself for anyone. America fell in love with her as Shirley Wilson, the sharp-tongued, no-nonsense waitress on What's Happening, and later, What's Happening Now. She wasn't just comic relief, she was a cultural fixture. For many black families, Shirley's character felt like someone you actually knew, bold, funny, protective, and impossible to ignore. She also kept working beyond the show, popping up in sitcoms and films, staying a familiar spark from the golden age of black TV. But while the public remembered her laughter, Shirley lived much more privately off camera. Unlike many entertainers, she didn't chase constant attention, and she kept her personal struggles largely out of view. Over time, her health reportedly declined, yet there was no huge media narrative around it. That's partly what makes her ending so painful. Fans didn't get a chance to brace for it. There was no farewell tour, no final goodbye, no slow public countdown. One day she was a living legend from a cherished era, and the next day she was gone, with most people only learning after the fact that something had been wrong. On December 10, 1999, Shirley Hemphill was found dead in her home in West Covina, California. She was 52 years old. An autopsy determined the cause was kidney failure. The horror of her death sits in its loneliness. A woman who spent her life making people laugh was discovered only after her body had gone still in a quiet house far from any spotlight. Her passing reminds us that some of the most devastating losses don't come with sirens, they come with silence. Yet her legacy endures every time classic black television is celebrated, every time a comedian dares to be unapologetically themselves, and every time audiences remember that Shirley Hemphill helped carve a path where there wasn't one before. Lamont Bentley. Lamont Bentley's story is heartbreaking because it ended just as his career and his life as a young father still felt like it was opening up. Born on October 25, 1973 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Bentley moved to Los Angeles as a kid and worked his way into acting with a mix of hustle and natural charm. Most people remember him as Hakeem Campbell on Moesha, the lovable, food-loving best friend who brought warmth and comedy to one of the defining black sitcoms of the 1990s. But Bentley had range far beyond sitcom laughter. He played the chilling Crazy K in Tales from the Hood 1995, appeared in The Wash 2001, and kept pursuing music alongside acting, building a future that looked steady and promising. What makes his death feel so cruel is how sudden and violent it was, one of those late-night tragedies that gives no warning and no second chance. On January 19, 2005, Bentley was driving alone in Southern California late at night when his car veered off the freeway near Simi Valley, Ventura County. The vehicle went over an embankment and Bentley was ejected. In the darkness, with traffic still moving, he was struck by multiple cars. He died at the scene. He was only 31 years old. There was no long illness, no time for goodbyes, just a split second that turned a rising life into a headline. For fans who grew up with Moesha, the loss felt personal. Hakeem wasn't just a character. He was that familiar friend in the neighborhood who made you laugh when life felt heavy. Bentley's death also carried a deeper sting because it highlighted how fragile success can be, especially for young black entertainers still trying to build security beyond the spotlight. He left behind 2 children, grieving castmates, and a generation of viewers who still rewatch his scenes and feel that absence. Lamont Bentley didn't get to finish his story, but the joy he gave on screen continues to echo proof that even a short life can leave a long light. Rasual Butler. Rasual Butler's story is tragic in a way that feels especially stark because it ended in an instant after a life built on steady grind and quiet respect. Born on May 23, 1979 in Philadelphia, Butler wasn't the kind of NBA player who arrived with non-stop hype. He earned everything through work. Drafted 53rd overall in 2002 out of LaSalle, he carved out a 14-season career by being reliable, coachable, and deadly from three-point range. He played for 8 NBA teams, including the Miami Heat, New Orleans Hornets, and Los Angeles Clippers, and finished with 809 regular season games, averaging about 7.5 points per game, and shooting roughly 36% from deep. To teammates, he was the veteran who showed up early, stayed late, and kept the locker room light. To fans, he was a reminder that longevity in the league comes from heart as much as talent. Off the court, Butler's life had started to look like a new chapter. After retiring from the NBA in 2016, he stayed connected to basketball through charity events and celebrity leagues, and he was often seen supporting community projects. He also shared a highly visible, loving relationship with singer Leah LaBelle, a former American Idol finalist. Friends described them as grounded and joyful, a couple that carried real chemistry and hope for the future. Their story felt like one of those late-blooming winds, hard years behind brighter years ahead. Then came the night that turned everything into silence. In the early hours of January 31, 2018, Rasual Butler was driving in Studio City, Los Angeles, when his vehicle crashed in a single-car wreck. Reports say the car was traveling at very high speed before Butler lost control. The SUV struck objects along the road, flipped, and slammed into a wall. Butler died at the scene at age 38. Leah LaBelle, only 31, also died in the crash. The shock rippled through both the basketball world and the music world, not just because of who they were, but because of how sudden and preventable it felt. Rasual Butler wasn't a headline chaser. He was a man who built a life through persistence, and his loss stands as a harsh reminder that in one reckless moment, even the steadiest journey can end. His legacy lives in the respect he earned, the teammates he mentored, and the quiet professionalism that made him beloved long after the final buzzer. Dalla. Dalla's story is one of hip-hop's most heartbreaking what-could-have-been endings. Bright momentum cut down at the exact moment his future was starting to open. Born Roderick Anthony Burton II on November 25, 1987 in Chicago, and raised in Atlanta, he grew up chasing music as a way out of chaos. He first made noise under the name Bucklight, then reintroduced himself as Dalla, a young rapper with a smooth melodic Southern style that fit perfectly in the late 2000s wave. His big break came when Akon signed him to Convict Music, placing him alongside a powerful machine of radio clubs and industry backing. In 2007, Dalla's single Who the F Is That Ooh, featuring T-Pain, broke through nationally and even charted on the Billboard Hot 100, signaling he was more than a local buzz act. He wasn't a superstar yet, but he was clearly climbing with the kind of label support and youthful hunger that often turns promise into stardom. But behind the rising career was a young man still navigating the dangers that shadow so many artists who come from hard streets. Dalla had lived through early trauma, and like many newcomers in the industry, he moved in spaces where reputation, ego, and old grudges could follow you across state lines. Friends described him as charismatic and ambitious, yet constantly on guard, caught between wanting a clean future and being pulled back into conflicts rooted in the past. That tension set the stage for what happened next, a confrontation that should have ended in words, pride bruised, maybe a shove, anything but what it became. On May 18, 2009, Dalla was at the Beverly Center in Los Angeles when he ran into a man named Aubrey Berry, someone he reportedly had previous tension with. The encounter escalated quickly near the valet area and shots were fired. Dalla was hit and rushed to the hospital, but he died shortly after. He was only 21 years old. The case stunned the music world not just because of the violence, but because of how senselessly fast it unfolded. One argument, a few seconds, and a rising life was gone. Berry was arrested and later went to trial. In 2010, a jury acquitted him after he claimed self-defense, leaving the death officially unresolved in the eyes of many fans. Dalla's legacy lives in that sharp, painful contrast, a kid who finally had a real path forward taken before he could fully become what he was building toward. His catalog is small, but the echo is loud, a reminder that fame can't shield anyone from the weight of old conflicts, and that sometimes the cruelest tragedies are the ones that arrive right at the doorstep of a dream. Charmaine Maxwell Brownstone. Charmaine Maxie Maxwell's death is remembered as one of the most disturbing freak tragedies in black music because it came out of nowhere and ended a life that had already survived the turbulence of fame, reinvention, and motherhood. Born on January 11, 1969 in Guyana and raised in the United States, Maxie rose to stardom in the early 1990s as one-third of the R&B trio Brownstone. The group's debut album, From the Bottom Up 1995, went platinum and produced the Grammy-nominated hit If You Love Me, a song that still lives in 90s soul playlists. Maxie's voice was the velvet edge in Brownstone's harmonies, warm, emotional, and instantly recognizable. Even after the group slowed down, she kept creating, working in Europe at times, and building a more private life with her husband, Danish producer Karsten Soul Shock Shock, and their son. For many fans, she represented that rare artist who could step back from the spotlight without losing her dignity or her love for music. Then came the night that turned everything into shock. On February 27 to 28, 2015, Maxie was at home in Los Angeles when a simple, ordinary moment became fatal. Reports say she was walking near a doorway while holding a wine glass, lost her balance, and fell backward. The glass shattered on impact, and in the chaos of the fall, sharp fragments cut deeply into her neck. The injury was catastrophic. Her husband found her bleeding and unconscious and called emergency services, but the wound was too severe. Maxie was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at the hospital. She was only 46 years old. What makes this death so horrifying isn't sensational rumor. It's the plain reality of how random and brutal it was. No long illness, no public farewell, no warning signs, just a freak accident that turned a household object into a deadly weapon in seconds. Maxie's passing hit fans hard because it felt so undeserved and so unreal. A woman who brought love songs to life ended her own life in a split-second accident at home where people are supposed to be safest. Her death also serves as a haunting reminder that tragedy doesn't always arrive with sirens or threats. Sometimes it slips in quietly, hiding inside the ordinary. Yet her legacy remains strong. Brownstone's music still carries her voice, and her story is remembered not for the accident that took her, but for the soul she gave to a generation, proof that even the most cruel endings can't erase a life that left beauty behind. Joanne Borgella. Joanne Borgella's story is a heartbreaking kind of tragedy because she represented hope in more than one world music fashion and the fight for self-worth. Yet her life was cut down by an illness that moved faster than anyone was ready for. Born on May 29, 1982 in Oyster Bay Cove, New York, Joanne was proudly Haitian-American, and she carried that identity with grace and strength. She first came into the public eye in 2005 after winning Monique's Fat Chance, a reality competition celebrating plus-size women. At a time when the culture wasn't kind to curvy bodies, Joanne stood tall, radiant, and unapologetic. Her win opened doors in modeling, and she became a face of confidence for thousands of women who had been told they didn't fit the standard. But Joanne wasn't satisfied with being a symbol in fashion alone. Music was her first love. In 2008, she auditioned for American Idol and made it into the top 24 on season 7, earning attention for her warm tone, emotional delivery, and quiet determination. She didn't win the show, but she won something else, a loyal audience that saw her as real. She kept building her career as a singer, model, and motivational voice, speaking openly about self-esteem and the courage to take up space in a world that tries to shrink you. Joanne was the kind of celebrity who felt human to people, not distant or polished, but relatable in the best way, like someone cheering you on from the same road. Then came the fight she never asked for. In 2013, Joanne was diagnosed with a rare form of endometrial cancer that spread aggressively to her lungs. Suddenly, her life tightened into hospital rooms, scans, and treatments. But even in that terrifying reality, she stayed outwardly brave. She shared her journey publicly with unusual honesty, posting updates, encouraging early detection, and trying to lift others who were battling their own illnesses. There was no denial, no fake optimism. She showed the exhaustion, the fear, and the faith, and that made people love her even more. Watching someone so full of life slowly forced into survival mode is a particular kind of cruelty, especially when they're still so young. On October 18, 2014, Joanne Borgella died at only 32 years old. Her death felt brutal not because of scandal or violence, but because it stole a woman who was actively building a legacy of empowerment. She had already broken barriers in fashion, stepped onto a national music stage, and become a voice for body positivity long before it was trendy. Joanne didn't just live beautifully, she fought beautifully. And even though cancer ended her story early, the confidence she gave people still lives on in every person who learned to stand a little taller because they saw her standing first. Simone Battle GRL. Simone Battle's story is one of the quietest yet most devastating tragedies in modern Black pop culture because it ended in silence while her career was still catching fire. Born on June 17, 1989 in Los Angeles, Simone grew up with show business. In her blood, she sang, danced, acted, and had the kind of bright, camera-ready energy that made people lean in. She first gained national attention in 2011 on the X Factor USA, where her fearless performances and magnetic personality stood out even in a crowded field. She didn't win the competition, but she left it with something more important: recognition that she had star potential. For a young black artist in pop, that visibility mattered. It was a doorway. That doorway widened when she joined the girl group GRL, a project connected to the Pussycat Dolls universe. GRL was being positioned for a major global push: sleek pop records, high-profile promotion, a growing fan base, and performances that hinted at real momentum. Simone was a core piece of the group's spark, bold on stage, warm off it, and visibly excited about where things were heading. To the public, she looked like a rising star with the road finally opening in front of her. But the hardest truth in her story is that what we see on stage rarely shows what someone is carrying underneath. Simone struggled quietly with depression, and people close to her later said she had been fighting deep emotional pain behind her smile. She was dealing with pressure, stress, and financial worries, but she didn't broadcast that battle. She kept performing, kept showing up, kept trying to be the light everyone expected her to be. On September 5, 2014, Simone was found dead in her Los Angeles home. She was only 25 years old, and her death was ruled a suicide. The shock wasn't just that she was gone, it was that so few people knew how much she was hurting. Her passing ripped through her friends, her group, and fans who had just started to imagine her future. GRL went on to release the song Ugly Heart soon after, and it became both a hit and an unintentional memorial reminding listeners of the voice they had lost. Simone Battle's death is heartbreaking because it reveals the invisible side of fame, the way pressure can crush someone even while applause is growing louder. She left behind not only music and performances, but also a painful reminder that mental health struggles can hide behind the brightest stage lights. Her legacy lives in the promise she showed, in the love her fans still carry, and in the urgent conversation her story continues to force the world to have about listening closer, checking in deeper, and never assuming a smile means someone is okay. Stephanie Mosley. Stephanie Mosley's story is one of the most heartbreaking and horrifying in modern black entertainment because it ended not in a public spectacle, but in a private nightmare inside the place where she should have been safest. Born on November 27, 1984 in Vancouver, Canada, Stephanie was a dancer with extraordinary precision and star power. She trained in ballet, then grew into a versatile performer who could shift from elegance to explosive hip-hop energy in a heartbeat. Her talent put her behind some of the biggest names in music. She danced for artists like Janet Jackson, Usher, Chris Brown, and Britney Spears, becoming the kind of industry secret weapon every major tour wants. But she wasn't content to stay in the background. Stephanie transitioned into acting and found wider fame as Asha on VH1's series Hit the Floor, where her charisma and athletic grace finally had a storyline and a spotlight of their own. To the public, her life looked like a dream that kept leveling up: major tours, TV success, rising recognition, and the respect of fellow dancers who knew how hard she had worked for every step. Friends described her as warm, professional, and relentlessly driven. Yet behind that glow was a relationship turning dangerous. Stephanie was married to rapper Earl Hayes, and reports from that period pointed to a volatile, painful dynamic fueled by jealousy and conflict. Like so many tragedies rooted in domestic violence, the warning signs were easy to miss from the outside. Talent can fill arenas, but it can't always protect someone from what waits behind closed doors. On December 8, 2014, Stephanie was shot and killed in her Los Angeles apartment. She was only 30 years old. Authorities said Hayes then took his own life, making the incident a murder-suicide. The horror of Stephanie Mosley's death lies in that brutal contradiction. A woman whose body created beauty and movement was stopped by violence in an instant, not by strangers or accidents, but by the person closest to her. Her passing stunned the dance world, Hollywood, and fans of Hit the Floor, sparking renewed conversations about intimate partner violence and how often it hides behind fame, glamour, or a polished social media image. Stephanie's legacy is not defined by the way she died, but by the light she carried while she lived. Every clip of her dancing still feels alive, sharp, fearless, radiant. And her story remains a painful reminder that some of the most horrible deaths aren't just about the moment someone is taken, but about the trust that was broken to make it happen. Merlin Santana. Merlin Santana's story is the kind of heartbreak that feels like a career was cut down mid-flight, just as the world was starting to see how far he could go. Born on March 14, 1976 in New York City, Merlin stepped into show business young and quickly became a familiar face to Black and Latino audiences across America. Many first noticed him as Stanley on The Cosby Show, but he truly broke through as Romeo Santana on The Steve Harvey Show. Romeo was charming, funny, and magnetic, the kind of role that made viewers feel like they were watching a future star grow up in real time. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Merlin seemed poised for a bigger second act. He was branching into music, exploring rap and production, and building momentum beyond sitcom fame. But real life didn't give him the time to become what he was clearly turning into. In the early morning hours of November 9, 2002, after leaving a location in the Crenshaw area of Los Angeles, Merlin was sitting in the passenger seat of a parked car when gunfire erupted. The horror of the moment wasn't only its suddenness, it was the reason behind it. Reports later revealed that a false accusation from a teenage girl sparked a reckless act of retaliation, and Merlin became the target of violence he had nothing to do with. In a matter of seconds, a 26-year-old life with so much promise was erased. There were no goodbyes, no warning, no chance to step away from danger. One cruel misunderstanding and a burst of rage ended everything. Merlin Santana's death shook people because it exposed how fragile fame really is. He wasn't a headline-chasing celebrity, not a man known for scandal, just a talented young actor trying to open the next door of his career. For fans who grew up watching him on warm, family-centered TV, his loss still feels personal. He remains a symbol of what violence steals, not only a person, but a future. Merlin left behind a legacy of laughter and charisma and a lingering ache that comes from knowing his story should have gone on much longer than it did. Wylie Draper. Wylie Draper's story is a quiet but devastating reminder of how brutally fast promise can vanish. Born on May 5, 1969 and raised in West Virginia, Wylie was first a dancer, sharp athletic, and naturally magnetic on stage. That physical storytelling became his passport into acting, and in 1992, he landed the role that would define his name forever, portraying the teenage to young adult Michael Jackson in the ABC miniseries, The Jacksons: An American Dream. It was a high-pressure part because he wasn't just playing a celebrity, he was stepping into the skin of a living icon whose movements the world knew by heart. Wylie didn't imitate, he embodied. His dancing posture and emotional nuance were so convincing that audiences felt they were watching Michael himself come alive on screen. The miniseries became a huge cultural moment, reaching tens of millions of viewers, and Wylie's performance was one of its most talked-about strengths. For a young Black performer, that kind of breakout should have been the start of a long, luminous career. Instead, fate turned without warning. Not long after the series aired, Wylie was diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia. The news was shocking because he was only in his early 20s, still in that stage of life where the body feels invincible and the future feels wide open. The illness moved aggressively, and within months it began stripping away the very energy that had fueled his artistry. The cruel irony is hard to miss. A man celebrated for movement was forced into stillness, and a performer just stepping into the spotlight was suddenly fighting for his life, far from cameras and applause. On December 20th, 1993, Wylie Draper died at just 24 years old, only about a year after the role that introduced him to the world. What makes his death so heartbreaking isn't just how young he was, but how close he was to something bigger. Viewers had barely finished discovering him before they had to mourn him. Yet even in such a short life, Wylie left a lasting impact. His family later created the Wiley Draper Foundation to encourage bone marrow donation and support young artists, turning his loss into a mission that could save other lives. Today, when people revisit The Jacksons: An American Dream, his scenes still sting with a bittersweet truth. Wiley Draper captured lightning in a bottle, and then the bottle was shattered far too soon. Stories like these remind us that behind every spotlight is a fragile human life. From leaders taken by bullets to artists lost to overdose illness or sudden crashes, each death sent shockwaves through Black culture and beyond. Their gifts reshaped music, film, sport, and the fight for dignity, yet their endings show that fame can't protect anyone from pain or the demons we hide. Their stories challenge us to look at systems, choices, and care for communities. Here on Legends of Black Excellence, we remember them with respect and with questions which losses were unavoidable.